So when in modern times, when we analysed the US and Russia, is it even useful to ask anymore whether they're enemies or allies? Because that binary is too limited for now, for today. The real question is whether they are now operating inside the broad geopolitical mood, even while pulling in different directions. And I think the answer is yes, but only up to a point. The deepest convergence between the US and Russia is not that they want the same world. They don't. The convergence is that both are increasingly comfortable, and not just them, with a world shaped by hard leverage, selective rules, pressure on weaker states, and transactional bargains. But the divergence is still fundamental. The United States still has a deep structural interest in preserving an international order it disproportionately shaped and still benefits from. Russia, on the other hand, often benefits from weakening that order, fragmenting it, and proving that it no longer works on Western terms. So this isn't a story of same. It's a story of overlap in methods, but we could say divergence in position. And once you widen the map beyond Europe, that becomes much clearer. Let's start with China. China is where the idea of US-Russia convergence hits a wall. For Washington, China is the central long-term rival, economically, technologically, strategically. Even the current tariff truce is already fraying again, with disputes over critical minerals and trade restrictions. That tells you something important. The US-China problem is not a passing irritation. It's more structural. For Moscow, however, China is something else entirely. For Moscow, China is an economic backstop, a diplomatic partner, and a way of offsetting Western pressure. Chinese actors have resumed seeking Russian oil, for example, and Beijing's official language keeps stressing an equal and orderly multipolar world rather than a US-led one. Russian elite discourse, meanwhile, openly treats multipolarity as both inevitable and desirable. But perhaps there's a correction to be made there, because if we're not careful, we might overstate the Russia-Chinese alignment. Russia's not simply partnering with China from a position of strength. It is also increasingly dependent on China in ways that create asymmetry. So yes, China is where the US and Russia diverge most sharply, but it is also where Russia's own room for maneuver may be narrower than it likes to admit. So perhaps they're not equal partners. Then there's India. And India matters because it complicates the familiar tendency to imagine the world as two camps with a battlefield in between. From a Western lens, India is often described as a democratic counterweight to China. From a Russian lens, India is a valuable non-Western partner that refuses full alignment with the Atlantic bloc. From an Indian lens, though, which is important, let's not forget, both of these readings are incomplete. Indian strategic thinking is much more comfortable with autonomy, hedging, and selective alignment. A good framing is, in a fragmenting order, India and Middle Eastern powers are navigating strategic autonomy, not choosing permanent camps or permanent alliances. That matters because it changes the board, the playing field, the geopolitical playing field. India is not simply being tugged between Washington and Moscow. It's using them both, while structuring its own choices heavily around the China question. Russian energy remains useful. US strategic partnership remains useful. Neither gets the whole of India. That's not indecision. That is more like statecraft. Then you have Turkey. And Turkey tells us something similar, but also different. Western analysis often tends to present Turkey as a difficult NATO ally rather than as a regional power pursuing autonomy in its own right. But Turkey sees itself as a regional power entitled to convert geography into autonomy. And geographically, Turkey matters. Why? Because it sits at the junction of Black Sea security, Russian gas transit, NATO strategy, Ukraine diplomacy, and wider regional energy flows. Reuters reporting this month shows Turkey deepening security cooperation with Ukraine while also protecting the Turk Stream route and stressing the strategic importance of Black Sea security. So yes, both Washington and Moscow need Turkey functional. But again, like India, Turkey is not equally available to both of them. Turkey's autonomy is real, but is still structurally anchored in the Western system more than Moscow would like. The point is not that Turkey sits between two powers in some passive sense. The point is that Turkey exploits overlap without surrendering its agency. That same pattern appears again in the Gulf and the wider Middle East, except here the stakes are, let's say, harsher. At one level, all major powers want the same basic things. They want to secure routes, shipping routes, energy access, influence over regional alignment, and avoidance of total uncontrollable collapse. But beyond that, the divergence is sharp. The US still seeks to preserve decisive leverage over regional order, as we can see from its multiple interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, etc. Russia seeks opportunity in disruption and seems to want to present itself as indispensable without carrying the full burden of regional policing. Reuters has reported that Moscow openly says that the current Middle East war is creating trade opportunities for Russian exports and boosting demand for Russian enemy. Now, if we look at the non-Western perspective, Chinese official language stresses multipolarity and rules through the UN Charter while resisting US primacy. Gulf strategic thinking, meanwhile, is often less ideological than Western commentary suggests. It's more about hedging, regime survival, shipping, escalation management, and keeping its options open and its income flows functioning. So the correction here is crucial. The Middle East is not simply a chessboard where Russia and the US act, as Syria might have suggested. It is a region where local actors are trying to survive and profit despite great power rivalry, and where outside powers often try to profit from instability that they can't fully control. Then, what about Africa? Africa is where Western analysis in particular, and outside analysis, by outside meaning outside of Africa, often slips into treating the continent of Africa as terrain that other countries move in rather than as political space with agency of its own. Yes, both Washington and Moscow, and China, by the way, can operate there pragmatically. For example, recently in February, the US lifted sanctions on senior Malian officials tied to Wagner-era networks as ties improved, while Putin has now floated a grain and energy hub in Egypt as Russia seeks alternative commodity routes under sanctions. That does support the idea that access trumps, no pun intended, ideology. But again, we can't go all in with that, and the correction would be Africa is not just where outside powers extract from, bargain, or compete. African strategic voices are increasingly explicit that global disorder creates both danger and room for repositioning. It has been suggested that in a fragmenting order, African actors need stronger moral agency and strategic positioning, not just adaptation to other people's games. So if we are serious, the conclusion can't be the US and Russia both do power politics in Africa. It's much too narrow. The better, perhaps, analysis would be that outside powers to Africa, pursue influence under different banners, while African actors are trying unevenly, imperfectly, to widen their own room for action inside a disorder they didn't design. And that brings us to the bigger frame. The world is clearly much less unipolar than it used to be, but it's not yet fully or coherently multipolar either. That is why often analysis can feel unstable, no? Because they're trying to force an old functioning, an old order, an old map onto a new emerging landscape. The US still has unmatched alliance infrastructure and system-shaping reach geopolitically in the world. Russia still has disruptive capacity, military weight, and the ability to exploit fractures. China presents itself as a language of orderly multipolarity, even as others fear the hierarchy beneath that language. India, Turkey, Gulf states and African actors are not merely objects of this contest. They're operating with their own vocabularies of legitimacy, their own leverage and their own survival logic. And yes, I'm aware that I've lumped in Africa as a continent rather than the individual countries. But it would be impossible to go into each one by itself. So the real story isn't that, or the real statement isn't that, the US and Russia are converging despite, let's say, their mutual support of Orban in Hungary and increasingly other authoritarian governments. Russia and the US overlap in methods more than many liberals would want to admit. They may diverge in ultimate position more than cynics sometimes admit as well. And the wider world is no longer simply waiting to be arranged by either of them. That is the most important shift. There's not a clean US-led order anymore, despite what US narratives might say. There's not a settled multipolar order either. But what there is a more fractured system in which different actors are speaking different political languages, carrying different levels of power, and competing to define what legitimacy and leverage means now. And that, I think, is the blind spot.